Uh, my name is Francesca Giardini, and I'm the host of this webinar series on disaster resilience. Every webinar meeting, we try to bring together people from different faculties, disciplines, perspectives. And today I'm very happy to have Clara Egger, who's a political scientist, and she will talk about the political dimensions of disasters and disaster management policies. And her work will be discussed by Hamed Seddighi from the campus Friesland. And Hamed, you have a background in psychology, right?
Yes.
Yes, excellent. So I'm looking forward to listening to your work, to your thoughts, discussion. The bit of housekeeping, usually we have 30 minutes for the speaker. And then followed by 10-15 minutes of discussion, questions, comments by the discussant, and then we have 5 to 10, 15 minutes left for the Q&A session. I don't know, Clara, if you want me to tell you when you are approaching the end.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, of the 30 minutes.
Lovely.
Okay, so yeah. I will tell you when there are 5 minutes left, and then you
Great.
can, okay. Excellent. So the floor is yours, Clara, please.
Well, thanks a lot, Francesca. Thanks, Hamed, for accepting to discuss my work, and thank you all for coming to this presentation. Well, I will share my screen. Okay. I think you should be able to see my screen, right? And if I do, can I do a slideshow? Yeah. Is it all right? Yeah? Excellent for everybody. Well, it's somehow a big and very large topic for a seminar presentation. Actually, I will not be speaking that much about my work on the political drivers of disaster, but I will focus mainly on disaster management policies and institutions. A few words about how it started, somehow my interest, and where it led me. So, well, I basically started with the picture on the left, studying the political drivers of different models of humanitarianism. And, well, I started with a project, which was my PhD project, comparing the approach of the United States, France, and the United Kingdom in terms of humanitarian policies. And I did field research, so here you have a picture on the top of Somalia and a picture of Kosovo on the bottom. So these were the cases I studied more in detail. And then that drove me somehow to take a much broader look on humanitarianism. That is a term that I will not be using in today's seminar, also because the label is very contested in itself by the players of the field. So I will speak of disaster management, crisis management institution. That will be the focus of the second project I will present, which is called NEWCOMERS, and try to unpack how this diversity of actors can be explained. And then with the COVID-19, of course, some of the interest shifted to look at the political impacts of COVID-19 containment policies on democratic governance. So this is the map you see. It's a map from international IDEA, looking at phenomena of pandemic backsliding. So where you have a question mark in red, this refers to concerning development regarding democratic governance. But I will discuss this more in detail in a minute. In terms of my research obsessions, Francesca knows I have many obsessions, but here I will speak about research only. These are a bit the question on the left that drive me into research. The first one is really trying to understand how we can account for the relationship between the provision of global public goods, and disaster management is a form of global public good, and international and domestic politics. How do these two aspects play out together? How can we design institutions at the political level that are more resilient to disasters? What's the role international cooperation agreements can play in that regard in bringing societies to be more resilient to disaster, more prepared for disaster? how can rather people be empowered in the management of crisis? So how can we make sure that actually communities are in the driving seat of these policies? And more recently, what are the impact of crisis on political attitudes? And that's a new project I'm developing. I will present in the end. Why did I somehow start to study that? Because on the one hand, in the disaster management literature, you have a focus on the broad concept of governance. And of course, this covers many different work, but the problem I have with the concept of governance in itself is that some or a large set of research is leaving aside the question of the governors, who are the one governing in this governance arrangements, and what drives the coexistence of different type of governance arrangements. What are the contexts in which somehow they are embedded? If you look at somehow also the disaster management literature, the role political systems in themselves, which I define by political institutions and political culture, play in shaping different forms of disaster response and disaster management policies, are still, it's still neglected somehow in current research projects. We have a lot of projects on bureaucratic politics, but very few on the type of political system, for example, the role of party politics, the role of an authoritarian culture, for example, that could lead to different forms of disaster management policies. And last, if you look at the literature on comparative politics, political economy, or public policy analysis, crisis management policies are considered as exceptional. So we make little use, I believe, of existing tools to analyze public policy, to apply it to this type of crisis management policy. So the focus is really on the role of leadership, which is something I somehow challenge in my own research. Is it working? No, it doesn't move. Oh, yeah, it's moving now. So I will just present a travel into a few ongoing research projects, because I think maybe that's the most interesting things to do. So the common features of my research project is first that they are strongly interdisciplinary. So I worked with very different disciplinary fields, as you will see, ranging from public health to economics, management, and so on and so forth. I use a lot mixed method research designs, so combining the analysis of quantitative data and qualitative data, mainly collected through field research or observational studies. And the theoretical framework I use is based on comparative or international political economy. There is a huge discussion about the use of the term, but I don't think we will enter into that discussion today. So the first project I wanted to present is called EXCEPTIUS. It's a bit slow from my side. So EXCEPTIUS is a collaborative research project that aims to provide a daily mapping of exceptional measures taken to contain the COVID-19 pandemic from the 1st of January 2020 until the end of June 2021. And we are focusing on 32 countries of the European Economic Area. And we also focus at the subnational level. So we are collecting data at the regional level. So for the Netherlands, this is the level of the security region. We have 3 objectives. So first off is to define and measure what we refer to as metrics of exceptionalism, not only looking at the restrictive nature of the decision taken, but also their modalities of implementation. So what is the role, for example, of the police, of the army in implementing the measures? And based on these new metrics, the idea is to assess the political impacts of exceptional measure on democratic legitimacy and stability in particular, and to unpack the determinants of these somehow various patterns of exceptionalism. We're working with 17 partners that are co-led by the University of Groningen and the University of Grenoble, and the project is funded by Zone NV. So you see a bit of like the organization that are part of the consortium. We're also working with a network of civil society organization, which is called Democracy International. This is how it's very, very, I don't know why this is so, not moving. No. Oh, yeah. Sorry, there is a rather long lag. So to collect data on the measures, I think we are one of the only projects that is really using legal data. So we don't collect data from press articles. We really look at the legal document introducing the measure. So we started by defining a taxonomy of exceptional measures that I will show in a minute. So with 9 classes and 95 subclasses, we constitute a corpus of legal sources, both at the national and subnational level for the 32 countries just presented. This corpus is open access, so if you go to the project website, you can download the data. And we combine artificial intelligence, so computational linguistic, with human coding. So we started with a manual annotation of a sample of the corpus based on the taxonomy, and also we, of course, open the project to the creation of new classes based on the experience of national coders. And we use this manual annotation to further refine and apply a multilingual legal artificial intelligence algorithm, which is called Roberta. And based on the initial results, we also recoded. So there is a lot of recoding going on to help refine the algorithm. So this is a bit somehow the backbone of the data collection process in our project. These are the classes we're working on. So as you can see, they are quite fine-grained, and this is a challenge. We have many classes and subclasses, and sometimes it's difficult because the amount of data we have to check the validity of the distribution of the classes is not high enough because the data is so fine-grained. But in terms of events, we are looking at state of emergency provisions, the restriction of fundamental rights and liberties, and this is based on the European Convention of Human Rights, the restriction of what we refer to as daily liberties, including compulsory medical examination, ban on sport events, you name it, closures, suspension of international cooperation agreements and commitments. So we have a lot of data on the evolution of asylum-seeking procedures in Europe during the pandemic. We are also looking at the mobilization of the police and of the army. And the 2 last events are on dealing with government oversight and transparency and public administration. In public administration, we are also introducing data on compensatory measures, and I will present a paper that has just been published on compensatory mechanism in COVID-19. We also collect data somehow to describe these events. So we analyze the authority that is deciding upon the measure, the duration, the targeted groups. So also the role of discrimination, right, in shaping decision-making in times of COVID-19, and the sanctions in case of non-compliance with the measure. I wanted to a bit maybe show how the data can be used with qualitative research I did. Sorry, it's really slow to move the slide. I have to. Yes, so this is the platform of the project. I will share the link with you at the end if you are interested. The data is available, and we have a very nice data explorer that has been developed by GeoDienst, where you can follow in real time how measures, the type of measures that were taken by different countries. So it's I found it pretty interesting. So here you have data at the national level, but we are now changing a bit the data explorer to adapt it to subnational data. What can you do with this data? So maybe I can present a research paper that has been published in the journal The Politics of the Law Countries. And the paper focuses on somehow something that is a bit neglected, which is the role of compensatory measures. Because since the start of the pandemic, most of the research has focused on restrictive measures, but we still need to know more about the use of compensatory measures and how do you maintain somehow the social contract in times of crisis. So our initial expectation was that compensators will be used a lot by governments that are implementing very stringent measures, right? That's quite intuitive. The more you constrain, the more you restrict the right, the more you use compensation. Well, in reality, and especially if you look at the three countries we are studying, which are the Netherlands, Belgium, and France, there is a disconnect between the use of compensatory measures and the level of restriction. So in the first phase of the pandemic, the Dutch government in Europe was really not among the most restrictive government, but yet introduced a lot of compensatory measures at the very beginning of the crisis, while in France, the measures initially were quite strong without any use of compensation, at least initially. So we're trying really to understand how democratic compensators are used in times of emergency. We define democratic compensators as decisions that are granting exceptional rights to not only individuals, but also institutions, political, judicial institutions, civil society organizations, at the national or subnational level in an attempt to compensate for the negative impacts emergency measures have on civil liberties and the rule of law. We make a distinction between embedded compensator and ad hoc compensator. Embedded compensator are based on the crisis management legal framework that somehow predate the start of a crisis, while ad hoc compensators, the name I guess speaks for itself, are introduced as the crisis unfolds. So they are not based on any pre-crisis legal framework. We developed three very preliminary hypotheses to account for the variation in the use of this compensator. So we have first an institutional account that basically argue that democratic compensator, and especially the embedded one, are championed by counterpowers. So the more counterpowers you have, the more compensators you have. We have a second hypothesis on the role of ideology. Namely that democratic compensators are supported and introduced by libertarian parties on law and order, parties or coalition. And we have a last account that is strategic, basically claiming that such compensators are used when governments face a decrease in political support. Of course, these hypotheses are complementary. This has to be deducted from my speaking time, right? So this is the comparative study design we are using. So we are comparing countries that differs on the key dimension we are exploring. So on the role of counterpower, we take into account both subnational and parliamentary counterpower. You see that the three countries are quite different. On also the ideology of the majority power of the coalition in power. So here we use the core of the Political Manifestos project and the Chapel Hill expert survey. And we also study the role of political trust, which is actually used to assess the role of strategic factors. So we look at the trust in institution and the evolution of the support in the government.
While we wait for the slide to proceed, you have 10 minutes left.
Yeah, thanks. Okay. Yes. So a few insights into the descriptive results we have. Basically, we find that embedded compensator, but this is not so much of a surprise. They really focus on how crisis decision-making is to be organized and on the role of the judiciary in checking also the action of the executive. So, for example, the role of the parliament in vetoing some of the decisions, the time and the content limit, and the role of also courts in designing new online rulings. That was quite unusual when we think about it, the idea that you could have a ruling online. In contrast, ad hoc compensators are much broader. So they focus on the extension of deadlines for administrative processes, possibility of having online oath, the participation rights of citizens, ensured by e-tools, and so on and so forth. We found that much more compensators were introduced in Belgium and the Netherlands than in France, and of course the time distribution of these compensators vary a lot, where basically Belgium and France started with somehow quite a high number of compensators, and then it decreased over the crisis. now, if we turn to our hypothesis, they are, well, partly supported. So yes, counterpower play a role, especially countries with low counterpower, such as France, introduce very low compensator. It's less clear for the Netherlands and Belgium, basically because in the case of Belgium, parliamentary counterpowers matter a lot, but less so did subnational counterpower. Whereas in the case of the Netherlands, the evidence is mixed. It is supported for other compensator, so compensator that predate somehow crisis management policies, like the start of the COVID-19. Whereas for embedded compensator, it is not supported. No, still well. In terms of the ideology of the political parties, and this is the finding we also find in another paper, even if crisis decision-making, the literature on crisis decision-making focuses a lot on the role of ideology and of the leader ideology. Well, we don't find a lot of evidence of support for the role of ideology in shaping the way government react to crisis. And in terms of strategic use, well, we find some evidence of a strategic use of compensator to compensate actually for loss in popularity of the government in the case of the Netherlands in particular, where more compensator were introduced when the government started to face criticism for their action. In terms of next steps, so we think that really the EXCEPTIUS data is useful because it is very fine grained and it allows to identify new country groupings. For example, in terms of the stringency of the measure, France ended up in a very unlikely group of countries composed of Poland and Hungary, for example. And it allows to also explain, the role of, as I said, political system, structural factors that really predate the crisis and that explain why some countries took a course of action. We intend to further detail the coding of measures, especially at the subnational level, and to engage in the assessment of the impact. We have a new PhD student joining the team, focusing on analyzing protests, why some countries witness a high number and range of protests instead others did not. I think I have, 5 minutes? 3 minutes? We started at 4? 5, great. 5. Well, I will say very, very few words about the other project I'm working on or trying to finish. It was a bit negatively impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic because I wasn't able to do field research, but this project is focusing on the analysis of the diversity of disaster management institutions, and we are particularly focusing on variation outside Western countries, so the usual suspect. We are looking at disaster management institution on the African continent, in Asia, in the Middle East, in Latin America. So this project is really looking at these actors that are very prominent, but not so much research in existing scholarship on humanitarianism, disaster management in a comparative manner. The first step of the project, as I said, this is a project combining case study, field research, and quantitative data collection, was the setup of a dataset of humanitarian organization that we'll now refer to as disaster management institution, that is covering more than 2,500 institutions globally. The paper, the presentation is based on a paper that is to be published in the coming weeks in International Studies Quarterly. And basically, what we argue in this paper is that so far we have a very biased view of global humanitarianism and disaster management policies, because we overwhelmingly focus on what is going on on international actors, and we tend to leave aside the role of community-based initiatives. I will just present very quickly. I just wanted to conclude with the results we found, but basically these are the criteria we are using to identify the organization. So first, the organization or the institution has to work in an emergency, chronic emergency context. I can explain in the Q&A session how we define such a context. and it has to self-define a substantial part of its activity as either humanitarian, emergency-related, relief, disaster, and crisis. So we use really textual coding. We look at the documents of the organization, the mission statement, to decide to include it or not. And we are not, our dataset does not include dormant or ceased organization. We are only focusing on active organization. So we have a number of organizations around more than 2,500. And of course, this is due to the inherent limitation of the data collection process that I'm happy to discuss also in the Q. These are the variables that you will find in this dataset. The dataset is also available online, so feel free to use it if you like and have a look at it. We look at the year of funding, the different types of organization. I think the key originality of the dataset is really to provide a way of looking at the organizational setup of organization in a comparative manner, so trying to get to a definition of what an NGO is in, say, Kenya, Mali, and the US. And we collect data on the activity, the areas of intervention, the targeted group, and what are the relationship to faith. I don't have much time left, but I wanted to just present a few very descriptive analysis. So this is the map of organization, disaster management institution per headquarters location in 2018. And you will see that, of course, the usual suspects are in this map, but there are also like huge concentration pockets in the Horn of Africa, the Sub-Indian continent, and basically each of the countries of the world has at least one disaster management institution of different form hosted in the organization. In terms of the distribution of the organization, so we find, again, we somehow, our data confirm the past research. NGOs and NGO Federation play a very, very strong role in disaster management, either at the be they national organization, community-based organization, regional or international organization, but also governmental entities. And what we find in our data is that a lot of countries, especially in Africa, started to develop ministries to really organize the disaster response activities. I will end on this and then discuss and open it to the discussion. The graph looks complicated, but the idea is rather easy. So what we did is to look at the number of creation per year. So this is only after World War II, even if the first organization, the oldest organization we have in our dataset dates back from 1099. So that's quite an old organization. But here we compare the rate of creation in different continents. And something that we do find is that although we refer to disaster management organization on the African continent or the Asian continent as new, they are not new at all. And most of them are actually as old as organizations that were created in Europe and Northern America. So you can see, for example, that the first organizations that were created in the Middle East and North Africa dates back from the end of World War II, even if we see, of course, an impact of some specific crisis. So the organization coming back from the MENA region are in green, and you see a strong impact of the crisis in Syria in driving up the creation of institutions, crisis management institution. I will end there, and I'm happy to answer questions about the next steps of this project and new research project I'm involved in. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Clara, for this very interesting presentation. And now I will give the floor to Hamed for his discussion.
Thank you very much, Clara, for your very interesting and informative presentation on your great studies. So I want to start the discussion with the one policy analysis method. That is the name of that is what's the problem represented to be. So we are governed by a type of problematizing of government, and government is a problematizing activity. And policy cannot get to work without first problematizing its territory. And so we are governed by the type of this problematizing of an issue. And it is believed that the policy proposal or suggested solutions by their definition contain tacit interpretation of the problem or problems that we claim to tackle. So this COVID-19 policies during your EXCEPTIUS project shows we can discuss about it with this type of interpretation, that the European countries and European government, what was their problem, what was the issue that they problematized? They wanted to answer to which questions, and how they define questions. So their solution is an answer to these questions that they founded. And when we find this problematizing of questions, then we can talk about the consequences of this type of problematizing and defining policies, and then we can find what are policy gaps, and then we can give them some better solutions to find. One thing that maybe I can think about it is most of countries, including European countries, disaster response and COVID-19 response is one of their problematizing, because the COVID-19 started and then they wanted to respond to this disaster, because the pandemic is a disaster itself. Maybe if another scenario, maybe it is that if they problematize the disaster itself and disaster preparedness, if they think about it before, that maybe in the future we will see a pandemic, then we should prepare ourselves for that. So these are our policies, and then maybe we can see a different policies for tackling the problems. And if we find this, and if we talk about the policies with this, what's the problem represented to be, then we can talk more about the protest, the risk perception of people, the trust to the government, and other consequences of these disaster policies. Because in other countries that maybe usually they are struggling with other disasters, for example, in the Asian countries, the South American countries, that they faced more political problems during different disasters, such as earthquake, for example, in some countries resulted in some problems in their country and protests and maybe a revolution after that. Maybe the lesson learned in that time is we should think before a disaster strike. And if we think about it before that, maybe we can work more on trust to the government. Because if we lose the trust to officials and trust the government now, then in the upcoming disasters, because it is climate change, it is the dynamic world, and if we lose the trust of people to the government, then how we want to manage disasters, how we want to tell them evacuate, how we want to tell them that, for example, you should a state of the order to stay at your home. So one thing we can discuss about this project is with this type of the policy analysis. The other thing is about the second project. It is very interesting, and it's an understudied topic about humanitarian aid organizations in the world. And it is very interesting that you showed us a map about distribution of these aid organizations. One question that maybe we can ask is what is the why we are observing increasing in number of and frequency of a number of these aid organizations in the world? Why they are increasing every day, and maybe what will be consequences of is this increasing in it is good or it is not good, and why government are doing that? And Another thing is the world and the disasters are a dynamic system. Every time and every moment is changing. For example, after your project started, this your second project, because data are belong to 2017, and after that we saw the COVID-19. That COVID-19 shows that there are changing environment for humanitarian aid. Different countries wanted to show their dominant place and position in the world by sending some vaccines to other countries, and every country has their partners for sending. For example, China, Russia send some vaccines, and for example, USA send another vaccines and medicine. So this is the world that they are competing on sending aid to different countries. How we can interpret this competition on sending aid to other countries, especially affected communities. And another thing that how we can another consequences maybe in increasing aid organizations is if we send aid and relief to different organizations, and if we help to the affected communities, especially in some authoritarian countries, what will be consequences of that? For example, if a country receives some money, some aid from the other countries, from the country X, then they can spend their money, their budget, on another thing, for example, on some corruption, some dictatorship attitude. So this is help to the country that they continue their attitude before that. And I don't know, is it a paradox? Is it aid or is it not aid to people? Especially we can see in some countries that it is a relative term, because some humanitarian aid organizations in some countries look like as a some organizations that are not as a terroristic organizations to the other countries. For example, if the humanitarian organizations from a country going to working in Yemen, for example, maybe the others look at it as a someone that is collaborating with the government to improve their influence on that country. So they are competing on that in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq. These things are happening, especially, and maybe we can interpret this increasing number of humanitarian aid organizations, especially in the MENA region, is because of they want to show their influence on the country. However, I think it is a very interesting topic, and we can have great discussion about this type of the interrelationship between disasters and politics and policy making, and what will be the consequence of that and the policy gaps in here. But I think we can hear more from the audience about their questions about this topic, and also I will be glad to hear your more discussion about this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hamed, for the very interesting and I would say challenging questions to Clara. I don't know, Clara, if you want to take maybe max 5 minutes to reply to at least a couple of points raised by Hamed before we open the floor. Yeah,
I surely can. I will try to be even shorter than that to allow more question. Well, a lot of your points, Hamed, and thanks a lot for your great discussion points. It's difficult, right, to answer in simple, with simple words about it. I think different things. I think the problem framing around what's the issue at stake, especially in terms of COVID-19, that's a relevant one, especially if you connect it to the fact, and this is one of the, well, maybe this is because I'm too naive, I should not be, but one of the most disturbing findings that we found actually on the pandemic responses, that actually you take the state of a country before the pandemic, you can plan where it will end during the pandemic and the type of measures it will take. Meaning that even if, as a researcher, we are called to produce good practices and find way of changing policies, the structural drivers matters a lot. And the long terms also direction of a country matters a lot. In another paper, for example, we found, and that's maybe also relevant to connect it to what's the problem at stake. We found that actually we're not the only one. There are quite a few papers now showing that actually the magnitude of the public health crisis is not associated with the type of response decided upon by government. What is driving the type of response is actually the expectation policymakers make on whether or not people will comply. So this is what we refer to as the vicious cycle of trust. When you have a government with very low level of trust, the measures will be very stringent to start with. This will create a further decrease in trust, and then this will create a further escalation of the measures. And then it's very difficult to break that cycle. And I'm not even sure you can break it during the pandemic. That's something for a program of reform, I would say, in the long run. So I think, this gives a lot of work to people working on political institutions. In terms of the complexity and dynamism of, a crisis, and maybe also the inability of crisis response policies to capture that dynamism, here I need to, I think I need to make a reference to the project we're working on with Francesca on mapping the role of political institutions in cascading disasters. So trying to introduce more dynamism to the model we have and understand the complexity of the events. Yes, the coverage of the organization we have in the humanitarian ends in 2018 because we had to end somewhere, and the data collection process was massive. But of course, we are planning an update in 2 years. Based on workshops. Did not present that, but the method we use is not only based on the analysis of documents, but on workshops that we organized with different organizations in Mali, Thailand, India, Mexico. So that's also something that we would need further funding to update the data set. But these are for the first, insights I could give on this very great discussion points.
Thank you, Clara. Well, I think that we can now open the floor